Welcome back to the Foreign Desk. I'm Lisa Daftari. Lots to unpack this week. And depending on which media outlets you're following, you're hearing very different news coming out of Israel. The protests going on there now for a few months, getting more heated. President Biden chiming in, many foreign leaders chiming into domestic affairs going on in Israel. But what really is happening there? I'm calling on my good friend and honestly the foremost expert in the world on this topic. I know he's very busy because everyone's calling on him to really unpack what's going on over there on the ground. Eugene Kontorovich, welcome to the program, my good friend. Eugene is not only a law professor at George Mason Scalia School of Law, he's also the director of its Center for International Law in the Middle East. He's also the head of International Law Department at Kohelet Policy Forum. That's a Jerusalem-based think tank. He's recognized as one of the world's preeminent experts on international law and the Israeli-Arab conflict. He's taught for more than a decade at Northwestern. He's a regular contributor to the Wall Street Journal, and he's testified repeatedly in Congress. You can see him all over media, again, depending on which media outlets you are looking at these days, but he is quoted very often, and I know he's very busy. So thank you for your time, Eugene, and welcome to the program.
Lisa, thank you so much for having me on. I'm also a huge admirer, and I love your show.
Thank you. Eugene, for somebody who has not been following what's going on, can you give us the Cliff Notes version of what is exactly happening on the streets of Israel right now?
Well, I think if someone came from Mars and was to be given the Cliff Notes version, they wouldn't believe it. So Israel does not have a written constitution. And instead, like most systems modeled on Great Britain, it has, at least on paper, what's called a system of parliamentary sovereignty. In other words, the parliament, which represents the people who are ultimately sovereign, gets the last word. Now, the Supreme Court in 1995, the Israeli Supreme Court, launched a process that they themselves called a revolution against popular and parliamentary sovereignty and seized all sorts of powers for themselves. They took the power of judicial review, which in America exists because there is a written constitution, and they claimed the power to strike down laws of the Knesset that they disagreed with. Then they went even farther, and they claimed the power to stop any government action, even including who to appoint to the cabinet, where to draw the borders, what the refugee quotas should be from other countries, that they could strike those down if they simply disagreed with them and thought that they were just did not balance the interests of different groups in society. Then they went even further, and they said that the Attorney General, so the Supreme Court, by the way, does not act like what you would think of as a court. It it does not hear cases from appeals. People go directly to the Supreme Court. You don't need to claim that you're hurt or in any way injured by a government action. You could just say you disagree, you think the government misunderstands what the law is, and you could appear before the Supreme Court with no fact-finding, no evidence. It just hears sort of policy arguments from both sides and can decide what to do. It then decided that the Attorney General, who is basically more beholden to the court than to the government, can strike down any government policy simply by saying so. So whenever the government has an idea that the Attorney General doesn't like, even including who to appoint to different jobs, he can just say, it's problematic, and it's over. In other words, the court and the officials empowered by the court have an absolute stranglehold over Israeli democratic processes, but it didn't stop there. The court went on to say that they can even strike down attempted amendments at the Constitution or provisions. They invented a constitution. They said certain laws have constitutional status, but if you amend them, we can also strike down the amendment. And to make matters worse, they have now claimed the ability to fire the Prime Minister, and they themselves, and this is crucial, are not picked by the government. The judges control the appointments of the judges. So what happened is eventually the government got tired of this, and the people got tired of this, and there's now an attempt to make the court at least somewhat accountable to the public, to introduce at least some checks and balances on the court. Now, it's also the case, as people around the world know, no one who has absolute unchecked power gives it up easily. And that is what we are seeing now.
So, I mean, if it's a matter of checks and balances, why are some of the reports out there? I contacted you this week because I was on a show and they asked me, is it true that one of the reforms is that Christians can't practice Christianity anymore? And I heard, on another news program, one of the reforms will be that Palestinians no longer can live in Israel. I mean, there are so many, there's so much, abduction of the narrative here. How did we get here?
That's a good question, but I think it's important to say the Supreme Court is, almost universally regarded of having a political leaning. In particular, it leans to the left. And unlike in America, where we have some liberal Supreme Court judges of great note, and you have some conservative Supreme Court judges of great note, because the court picks its own members, there's really there's a monoculture, an orthodoxy. There's a lack of different viewpoints. They obviously pick successors who look like them, who agree with them. There's overwhelmingly underrepresented Sephardi Jews or Jews from Arab countries, basically almost entirely absent on the Supreme Court. And as a result, the people who benefit from this status quo, which is principally the establishment on the left, have a huge interest in doing whatever they can to perpetuate it. So apart from a huge amount of misleading media narratives, they've also shut the airport and closed hospitals and encouraged disobedience or refusal to serve in the military to try to derail the reforms. So never before have we seen such a sort of broad set of actions designed to actually weaken the country, not just weaken the government in response to policies that you disagree with.
Right. And so just to summarize, basically what's going on is wanting to bring more democracy, right, to the country, having checks and balances, but yet the left realizes that they're going to lose their monopoly over legislative issues. And therefore now, like you said, closing hospitals, closing airports, going on strike, basically, to stop this from going forward. Now, let's connect this. I want to move away from Israel and look at the U.S.'s involvement in all of this, and then move back to Israel and what can be done there, and want to talk about the details on the ground. The reason I want to come to the United States is I want to get point blank your answer on this. What, if any, differences will this make in the relationship or the foreign policy between the United States and Israel?
This is not really about foreign policy. I mean, it's true the Supreme Court now also says it can veto foreign policy, but this is essentially a domestic issue, which, frankly, nobody outside of Israel should notice. Just to make it very clear, the Supreme Court in Israel did not have the powers that it has since seized until 1995. So if you think Israel was a democracy under Prime Minister Rabin, under Golda Meir, it's certainly going to be a democracy after these reforms, which don't even turn the clock all the way back to 1995, but just introduce some minimal checks. So if the United States was not objecting to Israel not being a democracy or the Supreme Court having not enough power in 1995, which it wasn't, there's no reason for them to get involved now. And on the other hand, President Biden has gotten involved.
Right.
And it's a bit absurd because President Biden has come out and really challenged these reforms, whereas at the same time, just recently, he proposed packing the United States Supreme Court, which would actually give him almost complete power over every decision in the court by just adding as many judges as he could need to get a majority. Now, I happen to not think court packing in America is unconstitutional. Certainly, President Biden doesn't think so. And if he almost, wanted to take over the U.S. Supreme Court, and that was not undemocratic, certainly, at least having the judges not pick themselves in Israel should not be undemocratic. So we see it's not about democracy. It's not about shared values. President Biden is intervening in a heated domestic political context to prop up one side in that contest. And unfortunately, it's the side that wants to perpetuate the undemocratic powers of judges.
And it's interesting because we knew that President Obama got involved in the attempting to stop the re-election of Bibi Netanyahu, and now we're watching, as many say, the Biden foreign policy being the 2.0 of the Obama foreign policy. According to many, there are many similarities there, and then seeing this involvement as Kamala Harris and President Biden have both told Bibi and warned him not to continue quote, going down this path, whatever that means, and getting involved, where you have, individuals like Nikki Haley and others on the right in this country connecting with Israel's right. I mean, what does this mean, or will this have any effect on the foreign policy between the two countries going forward?
So first of all, I want to say that what President Biden is doing goes much further than what President Obama did. President Obama tried to get, involved in one election to make the people he liked win over the people he didn't like, Prime Minister Netanyahu. Biden is getting involved in issues that really get to the heart of Israel's constitutional system. Biden wants to, basically perpetuate a system which would make elections in general matter far less and give power to unelected officials. So that goes beyond the results of any one election. He's trying to say even when a government is elected that wants to introduce changes into the power of the judiciary, that should never be possible. He basically wants to be the undemocratic Alexander Hamilton of Israel, to write Israel's constitution for it. That's quite shocking. It shouldn't interfere with Israel's with the mutual relations between the two, because the two countries have such strong mutual interests, such a shared history, truly shared Judeo-Christian values. But at the same time, it most likely will, because I think we see that President Biden is likely to try to retaliate against Israel to punish Prime Minister Netanyahu. We just saw reports just before I went on. Israeli space scientist was going to appear at a NASA conference, and his participation was canceled, apparently, by the United States. So even shared security interests are going to be harmed, I'm afraid, by the Biden administration.
It's absolutely absurd when you think about it, that Israel would be punished for domestic issues that have nothing to do with its foreign policy with the United States. That frankly hasn't changed for decades, but yet each time there's a new guy, or perhaps in the future woman, in the White House, that relationship comes under question. But I want to tie this into just global perspective and the narrative here. You have irresponsible journalists like Mehdi Hassan at MSNBC, Peter Barner at the New York Times, who have come to Twitter and in their writings and on air, try to connect very, very irresponsibly and very falsely, try to connect this with what's going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis in the Holy Land, and tried to say, well, if the Jews were better to the Palestinians, you'd have more democracy there, or there wouldn't be apartheid there. Rashida Tlaib also putting up, taking advantage of this time to perpetuate these lies. And when you have from the White House this disinvitation or not putting an invitation to Bibi Netanyahu, trying to create that distance in order to perpetuate these false narratives. I mean, how do we fix this?
How do we fix it? I think, first of all, one needs to be properly cynical. And this is why it's so useful about, to have serious news programs, not on channels much like yours. We need to be appropriately cynical about what we read and what we see. And I've encountered it now just time after time. People have certain misconceptions. I said, where'd you see that? Where'd you get that from? I read it in the newspaper, so it must be true. One needs to really, I think, learn how to analyze sources and analyze reporting to see if it's based on actual sources. Everyone needs to do that for themselves. And the amount of misinformation is extremely serious. And if only it was Mehdi Hassan and Peter Barner, but it's also much more mainstream.
Right.
So one needs to be able to evaluate the facts oneself. One needs to learn how to do that.
I want to go back to Israel, because obviously we can't solve the mainstream media's issues and their bias or the left's bias in this country. We obviously have elected officials in Congress who are there with the priority of bashing Israel, not promoting the United States, and we know that, and we know that they're there, and they make no qualms about it, because they don't have to make any qualms about it. You recently, I think yesterday, had a piece in the New York Post together with Ariel Davidson, another good friend of ours, and you write, the title being "Israel's Protesters Are Enemies, Not Heroes of Democracy." You end the piece by saying what's unfolding in Israel is not a Bibi problem, it's a democracy problem, and those portraying themselves as heroes of democracy may actually be hurting it. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, so first of all, the headline I did not write, and I don't regard the protesters themselves as being enemies of democracy. As a matter of fact, I think the protests, in a sense, contradict the main argument of the protesters, which is that Israel does not have enough democratic checks, that it's too easy for the legislature to get things passed. We see the Israeli public are not like sleeping sheep. The government can walk all over. There's a mobilized, strong civil society. At the same time, the political leaders of the protest movement, and politicians like Yair Lapid, are essentially trying to solidify a system that makes the results of popular elections really not matter so much. Because if the left wins, they can implement their policies, as it should be. That's democracy. If the right wins, the attorney general gets to tell them not to implement their policies. That's a fundamental problem with democracy. And if there's no way to change it, this is a crucial point. The current system in Israel was not decided upon by the people. It was not decided on by the Knesset. It was never decided on at all. The court just made it happen with the support of government elites and bureaucracies. If that system, which was never accepted by the people, is now locked in stone, and you can't even talk about small changes to it as the government is trying to do, if the protests basically mean, meet your new leaders, you're stuck with them forever, the judges of the Supreme Court, who most people couldn't name, then that's a crisis for Israeli democracy. And I want to say, in America, one reason America is such a robust democracy is even when the court does decide things that people think are illegitimate. So the Supreme Court decided Roe v. Wade in the 70s. A lot of people thought it was a horrible decision, right? That really put human life in jeopardy. They don't need to take to the streets. They don't need to shut the airport and the hospital. They can participate in the political process. They can convince people. They can elect politicians who then will put in new judges in vacancies who can eventually change the opinion of the court. And now we have Dobbs. If you think Dobbs infringes on women's rights, hijacks a woman's body, you don't need to have a revolution. You can elect politicians who will make that perspective eventually felt on the court, which is why it's shocking that the reaction in Israel to simply the ability of politicians to pick judges for the Supreme Court is far more dramatic than we saw the reaction to Dobbs and Roe versus Wade and court packing combined. Mm-hmm. And the reaction, because right now, one political perspective doesn't have hope, right? They can win every election, right? And they're never going to get a majority on the Supreme Court.
It's interesting because you talk about it not being a Bibi problem. And then for anyone who has been following politics in Israel, it's very difficult to get a coalition. Most governments are either unable to or don't serve out the full term. There's a lot of turmoil with the current system. And yet Bibi continues to come back onto the scene. My point being, regardless of these domestic issues, the issues of national security, which Bibi is very strong on, the issues of the borders, of the issues of keeping Israel safe, continue to be bipartisan. I mean, this is what's lost in the media. Am I wrong?
No, that's exactly right. Israel is a crucial security ally. Israel and the Israel-American relationship is crucial, but I think one thing that is changing is Israel is an ally against American enemies in the region. Throughout the Cold War, it was at the forefront of the fight against communism. It was an island of stability during the Arab Spring and the ISIS period. But now America's greatest strategic threat is from Iran. And the Biden administration does not seem particularly serious about confronting that problem. And one theory is that the Biden administration wants to weaken Bibi now, weaken Prime Minister Netanyahu, because he favors a strong policy on Iran, which would intrude with the administration's policy of basically leaving the region to itself.
So let me ask you this. I see a lot of parallels here, right? Even during this conversation, you're confirming a lot of these parallels that I'm seeing between the United States and Israel, mainly in that, does Israel's left not understand the larger issues here? Meaning they are, a minority in the Middle East. They are obviously surrounded by their enemies. Obviously, national security is a huge issue. That their enemies are watching and really enjoying what's going on inside Israel right now.
Okay, so they are, and it just shows you that how that when we talk about the Supreme Court, we're not just talking about judges who decide some disputes. We're talking about what is essentially a supreme legislative council. So people are willing to do pretty extreme things to perpetuate power. Unfortunately, at the same time, I think the you know to the extent if Iran is watching this and enjoying it, I think their pleasure is mistaken. I think fundamentally Israeli society remains strong. I think the military remains prepared to respond to any action. But of course, it is a completely needless diplomatic distraction. But I wouldn't overstate its effect on Israeli readiness. And I think any regional actor that would come to that conclusion would do so to their detriment.
I want you to address some of the nuances within Israeli society. So, a lot of people who are watching this see this as a fight between secular and religious. Some see it left and right. Some see it as Sephardic versus Ashkenazi. I mean, there are a lot of undercurrents in this small country, the size of the state of New Jersey, as we always say. Can you explain some of these cultural, underpinnings that are contributing to what's going on in the protests?
Sure. So Israel is a country with a strong that was founded by socialist parties, run by Jews from Europe, Ashkenazim, which is where they got the socialism, and it was run by basically the same coalition of left or socialist parties for 40 years. And so there are numerous fault lines, and they don't completely map onto this, but basically the sort of original socialist government founders of the country, they created, and even like directly with their children, a kind of aristocracy, which even as the right began to win elections, managed to still control important institutions in Israel, the universities, major government companies, certain big businesses. And of course,
like the United States,
of course, the Supreme Court. But Israel is a much more statist country, right? So the link between these major institutions and the government has often been closer. And there's this idea in Israel of government bureaucrats have far more power. There's this idea that the point of government bureaucrats is not to implement the will of the people, but to make sure the will of the people is not implemented if it's unreasonable. And these are the heads of the security forces. So while the population of Israel is very diverse, there is a greater commonality of interest. But I think the principal divide here is just a left-right divide, which itself, maps onto certain demographic things. But that is the main thing. Let me put it this way: currently, the Supreme Court, right, has the leading role in selecting judges. And if Yair Lapid thought the Supreme Court was going to select right-wing judges, would he want to preserve their power to pick judges? Right? If Justice Scalia, if Brett Kavanaugh was the chief judge of the Supreme Court, if you had the American Supreme Court in Israel, would Yair Lapid say, you know what? It's crucial that they be able to pick their successors. He'd say, no, we need to pick their successors. But that's not the case, right? It's the opposite. So the left has a basically vested interest in the current system because they think it's overwhelmingly going to work to their benefit. If they didn't, they'd want to change the system.
So, okay, their benefit, but be more specific. You're obviously, you come from a conservative viewpoint. You also live in Israel. So I want to make sure our audience understands that you're not just, Monday morning quarterbacking this and looking at it from the perspective of a law professor. You happen to have both perspectives, and you live in Israel. You understand the society. You understand what's going on in the legal system and all of that. You literally have a front seat view of all of this in real time. Obviously, you come from a conservative background. It's in your bio. If you were on the left, what are you fearing right now?
It's not even a matter. I wouldn't even say it's a matter of fear.
Why are they on the streets? You watch these videos. That's why Hamas and Hezbollah they're enjoying these videos. You watch these videos. It's as if they're crying as if their life is depending on these reforms, which is why it's so easy for those who want to abduct the narrative. They've been able to, right?
I think every time, people who, undemocratic regimes always invoke the threat of some danger to the rights and security of their population in order to claim their power.
Right.
And what the defenders of the Supreme Court are saying is these guys are going to do crazy things. They're going to cancel elections. They're going to put gays in jail. And basically, they have a completely invented list of horrible consequences, which
are being believed,
which are just completely invented. And it's a powerful slogan. In a sense, I'll tell you the tactical problem the reformists have is the opponents of reform come with fear. They're going to take away democracy.
Mm-hmm.
And the supporters of reform say, hey, we're going to introduce checks and balances. Can we tell you about the Federalist Papers, Montesquieu? We have some reforms to the system here. Things are going to be better. And it turns out that selling fear, regardless of how irrational, works politically better than selling hope and sort of concrete policy proposals.
It seems to me, I mean, again, more of these parallels between the United States and Israel, but we're moving towards this society and generation of not being able to tolerate different opinions. And there's one, lastly, before you go, because I do, first, I want to get your opinion on what's going on inside Israel, how this will pan out. Someone said to me the other day, I feel sorry for Bibi. He's stuck between two extremes, meaning his own party has gone to the extreme right, and he is obviously battling the extreme left. How will this pan out? Will Bibi be at the helm, or will his own, again, parallels to Donald Trump, right? His own legal battles. So he's fighting so many different fronts. How do you think this will pan out for him?
I think we clearly see that a lot of the tactics of the opponents of reform, basically it is the anti-Trump resistance movement, I think was literally put in a box and mailed to Israel. Exactly. I think the best proof of that is the handmade costumes, suggesting there's going to be some kind of threat to abortion rights. Now, in Israel, there is no political controversy over abortion. It is not on the top 10 political issues. It's not on the top 100 issues, because it was never, unlike in America, abortion issues were never set by the court. That was actually one thing they never touched. There's a political compromise which is uncontroversial. It's not something even the most right-wing politicians talk about. So what's with the handmade costumes? I think, like, literally, they are either playing to the cameras to frighten Western audiences, or they just sent them from America.
Can I offer perhaps a third? Yeah. What do you think about these? And I'm sorry to cut you off, but this is important. What do you think about the Biden administration giving government grants, funding to organizations, third-party organizations on the ground in Israel? They're basically paying for the opposition to launch these protests.
So there has been evidence of some money, small sums, that went directly from the State Department to the organizers of the protest, which is shocking enough. The bigger question is how much money has gone sort of indirectly through third channels to the organizers. That's pretty shocking. But I think, now we see the president going even further and sort of directly, personally intervening in one side of the conflict, not even on one side of this dispute about the powers of the Israeli Supreme Court and the selection of the judges, rather than being behind the scenes. I think the goal is, in fact, to paralyze the government in a way similar to the anti-Trump resistance. The difference is, Prime Minister Netanyahu is a politician with, I think, broader appeal than Donald Trump, as evidenced by the fact that he keeps winning election after election after election. And I think that is what might have finally motivated the desperation of his opponents to take such extreme tactics. Because if you can't beat them at the polls, beat them by closing the streets. So those are some similarities. But in fact, I think I want to emphasize also the differences. In America, even when you don't have a right-wing government in power, you can have a Supreme Court that leans to the right, and vice versa. You can have a right-wing government and a left-wing Supreme Court. Right. In Israel, only one of those configurations is possible. You can either have a left-wing government and a left-wing Supreme Court, or a right-wing government and a left-wing Supreme Court. And that is what these reforms are attempting to change.
Right. I want to get lastly, because I know we're running out of time. I can speak to you forever about this because you are just a wealth of information. I want to get your thoughts on an incident that happened actually here in the United States at Stanford Law School. And the reason I want to get your thoughts on this is, again, showing this movement to really shut down the other side. The Federalist Society at this law school invited Judge Kyle Duncan, he's a conservative judge on the U.S. Court of Appeals Fifth Circuit, to speak. A nice invitation. Perhaps you don't agree with him. They literally shut down his speech. They were heckling, they were bullying, they were threatening him, hoping that he dies. He should, I mean, all of these awful things at a law school. These are future attorneys. They're not children. And there were professors there who allowed this to happen. There were deans there that allowed this to happen. I mean, how did we get to a place, whether, again, in Israel, as you said, I think there's a lot of ripple effects in this. But the reason I bring this up is we're educating the lawyers of the future, people who have they're responsible for learning different opinions, dissenting opinion, tolerating different opinions. And look at this episode.
Yeah, if I was a client with a case in front of the Fifth Circuit, I would make very sure now that I don't have a Stanford Law School alumni working on that. So, because remember, lawyers are agents for their clients. They're responsible for their clients. And how are they going to be able to faithfully represent their client in front of this judge now? There does seem to be some kind of growing hysteria. I think in the case of, and I speak often for the Federalist Society. I've never encountered, no, once at Chicago, actually, I was shouted down by pro-Palestinian, as they call themselves, protesters. But I think part of this comes from a broadening of the definition of harm. Harm used to mean punching someone in the face or damaging their stuff. Now they have defined harm in a way to mean disagreeing with their views. And that, of course, is a recipe for being able to squash any kind of political dissent. But I want to say the good news. The dean of the law school, Professor Jenny Martinez, has since then written an amazing letter, which is, I think, really a document of great importance about the freedom of speech and how the law school is going to stay out of these debates. And crucially, that, don't look to the law school to hold your hand in sensitive issues, meaning it's not the job of the law school to comment on every political development, to condemn or support. And that speakers have to have a right to speak freely. So in a sense, this crisis, I think, has forced people to confront how far out of control the situation has gotten. And we see mature, responsible adults trying to actually take control of the situation for the benefit of free speech and open debate.
Right. They should do better, and I hope that this will be an example going forward for everyone to learn from. Eugene, we will call on you again. Obviously, this is not enough time, but thank you for your expertise, and thank you for your hard work on all of this. For those of you who'd like to follow Eugene and his brilliance, you can follow him on Twitter. He's got some amazing tweets, amazing articles, and I think he does post them often there. We will try to echo many of them there. For those of you who'd like to sign up for our daily top 10 email, go to foreigndesknews.com. You can sign up there. And to sign up for our weekly podcast, you can get that at youtube.com/Lisa Daftari or wherever you get your podcasts. We will see you all next week.